Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name is Steve Peterson, and this is my 2014 Hyundai Veloster Turbo, a custom project that has been ongoing for about 11 years. This is a spare engine that I've started kind of tearing down. In a couple other videos, I've shown how to remove the intake manifold, and I've kind of done a little bit of a walk around and talked about all of the parts on the engine. For this video, probably going to end up being a two-part series. I will go through the complete removal of a OEM turbo. So start to finish, basically, I'm going to show you all the pieces here that need to be removed. And I'm going to show you that with the engine out of the car so we can actually see what some of these parts are and where they go. And, you know, where bolts are and things like that. Instead of me trying to record, you know, while being underneath the car and shove the camera up into like little tiny spaces, I'll be able to show you a lot more here with the engine on the stand and the turbo installed on here. Now, I have already removed this turbo once. It's kind of lightly installed back on here with just a couple nuts and bolts. So removal is going to be very quick for me in showing, you know, each step of the process. But when it comes to doing this yourself, I do recommend taking some precaution. There's some things that can be damaged and some things that can be, you know, put back together wrong. If you plan on reusing some parts, you know, there's some parts that you should have on hand, you know, new, like some gaskets and such. I will try to cover all of that as well in this video. I also say this may be a two-part video because here behind me on the table, I have a turbo that's kind of broken down already, that was damaged, the housing, blown up basically. And I have a brand new stuffed turbo, basically an upgraded, bored out turbo from KTM Tuners. This came from Pure Turbos, and I want to show what this looks like as a brand new out of the box turbo. And then on here, once I get this off, I'll show you some of the failures of this specific turbo as well. This was my original OEM turbo that came on this car that I blew up a few years ago. So I'll get to showing you what that looks like as well. In the meantime here, again, I want to say just take some precaution when doing this project. There's a lot that could potentially go wrong. So I just want to point out that you need to, you know, be careful and be mindful about what you're doing so that you don't damage or injure yourself with this project. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to say this is probably, I don't know, for most people, probably a 7 on the 1 through 10 scale. It is kind of a process to get everything that you need to get removed and out of the way, to get the turbo physically out of the engine bay. And I will show you some of those things on my own car, because obviously that's all assembled and put together, and you know, I'll be able to point at some things that aren't here on this engine. With that being said, let's kind of dive in, and I'm going to take you kind of on a walk around here, closer view of this engine currently out of the car. I'm going to point at some stuff here, and then I'm going to take you to my engine bay and show you a few things that need to be removed kind of from the get-go before you can do anything else with the turbo removal. Here we are much closer to the engine, and we are currently looking at the back side of the engine. So this is the side that would be in between the engine and your firewall, and this is why I wanted to show you all of these things on the engine stand while the engine is out of the bay, because there's a lot of bolts and, you know, things that are difficult to see locations of when I'm explaining what they do and where they're located and how to remove them. I hope everybody's going to be ready to pay attention in this video, because I'm going to cover a lot of stuff today. We are going to try to make all of this go quick. I'm going to explain things but not go crazy deep. I just hope you're ready, because I'm going to cover a lot of stuff here. Basically here, again, this is the back side of the engine. We come around here. This is the front side of the engine. This is obviously where the intake manifold used to be. We've got our valve cover here around the top. I want to say, while I'm mentioning the valve cover, it is possible to remove the turbo from the engine bay without removing the valve cover, okay? I have done it. It is a little bit more difficult to, let's call it, finagle and wiggle the turbo out from back behind the engine with the valve cover on. But I have a trick that I will talk about that helps me. I think it's easier to do my trick than it is to take the valve cover off. If you feel it necessary, pull the valve cover. It's really not that difficult to remove the valve cover. I will be making a separate video on that, so stay tuned for that. But I'm going to basically remove the turbo off this engine without taking the valve cover off today. I just want to point out that, you know, it does make it easier. And what I mean by making it easier is that you need to get the turbo from behind there, in between the firewall and the engine, out the top. It's possible to go out the bottom, but that means now you got to remove CV axles, and it's just, I don't like messing with all that. I can pull the turbo out of the top of the engine bay. Obviously, if you have a strut brace, the strut brace needs to be removed. And I basically remove this upper engine mount over here, this factory engine mount. Here it is right here on this engine. So in order to allow the engine to kind of sink in the engine bay down a little bit, and you can kind of roll the engine forward in the engine bay by removing the upper passenger side engine mount. Now, you don't just remove it and let the engine fall, okay? You put a jack underneath, underneath the engine, supported, and, preferably in a good supportive spot with like a 2x4 or something. And you can jack up the engine and take the weight off of this side of the engine. And once you've done that, you can take this engine mount off, and the engine will just kind of float in there in your engine bay, because there's a mount over here on this side where your transmission mounts to the frame that still holds this side, and then the center wishbone mount that goes to the underside of the block that's in the center that bolts to your subframe is also still connected, okay? My trick really doesn't work if you're running the upgraded lower mount. Like if you're running a poly mount down there, there's not going to be enough flex for the engine to kind of sink down the way you need it to. But if you're running a stock mount, or even like a mount with the poly bushings, the harder bushing inserts, you'll still be able to do this. So again, remove this engine mount and put a jack underneath the engine, and you'll be able to lower the jack down, and the engine will kind of sink down on this passenger side and want to roll forward just a little bit, as long as you position the jack in the right spot. And by allowing the engine to drop down a little bit and roll forward, you can create enough space back here to get the turbo out from between the firewall and basically the valve cover, because the valve cover is what stops you at the top. There's enough space to kind of maneuver the turbo up and out. It does take a little bit of work. It's not the easiest thing to do, but again, it can be done. You can basically, once you get everything unbolted off of here, you can kind of grab the turbo and turn it and get it to finagle out of that area, that hole. So with that being said, there's a couple things that I recommend doing before you just start wrenching bolts off of here, okay? You're going to want to drain your coolant and your oil. You're going to make a mess of coolant if you don't, because you need to take these two coolant lines off. And you're going to make an oily mess on top of that, because there is an oil feed line and an oil drain line coming off the turbo housing that you also need to remove. And the moment that you undo the coolant and the oil hoses or lines, you're going to have a mess. So drain your coolant, drain your oil in your engine, and drain your coolant at the radiator. In order to drain your coolant on your factory radiator, on the driver's side, bottom corner, there's a plastic, like twisty plug that you can unscrew, put a pan underneath it, and catch all of your coolant. That'll drain your radiator, drain the coolant system pretty much, so that when you remove your coolant lines here, you don't make a big mess. So as I was just talking about, these are your coolant lines. These are an inlet and an outlet. They have coolant that run from over here, there's a coolant supply tube that is connected to this coolant elbow that is connected to a coolant line that goes to your radiator, fill, and all of that. So from the back side here, these two bolts right here will be removed at some point so that these coolant lines can be removed off the turbo. On this turbo here, also on the top, you can see this bolt. There is your supply line, your oil supply line at the turbo goes here. And then it connects. It's really hard to see, but it connects right here. This little 2-bolt flange. They are 10mm bolts. They are very small. They're not very tight in there. They're pretty easy to get out. They're in a kind of a tough spot, but eventually you will need to get to those. Okay. Again, we're not going to touch the oil lines and we're not going to touch the coolant lines pretty much until last. Okay. Because I like working in this, getting all of these bolts that might be stuck and stuff out of here before I even make a mess of coolant and oil anywhere. So let's skip past coolant and oil lines for a moment and start back here up at the top, because there's some stuff that needs to be removed in your engine bay before we can even start touching turbo. This is your turbo inlet pipe here. You see it off the back of the engine. Your air from your air filter, your air box, your cold air intake, whatever you have on the car, goes in here. You can see what that pipe looks like. That's what it looks like off. Air goes boom, and then it goes into the turbo. Okay, as you can see on this side, boom, there it is. It goes into the turbo. Okay, when you remove your intake here, get it out of the way, get it out of the engine bay, get it out of the way. You can now work on this pipe next. Attached to this pipe is a couple things that you need to be aware of. From the factory, there's this really crappy ground wire that is bolted to the inlet tube, and it's also bolted right here on your strut brace. You can see on mine, I've replaced it with a nice fat ground wire, but from the factory, yours most likely looks like this. I recommend replacing this anyway. To remove this, you can either unbolt it off of the strut tower, or you can unbolt it here at the pipe, but you need to remove that. And then further down here is another bracket, and that bracket holds your boost control solenoid. So the electronic boost control solenoid, the thing that tells the turbo, or tells the wastegate when to release pressure, basically. And there's just two lines that connect on the turbo. There's a vacuum, and one goes to your wastegate. You're gonna squeeze the little clamps, and you're gonna take those off. Whoop, whoop, just like that. So you can see that's what those look like. You just pull them right off. And once you've pulled those off, you're going to be able to pull the electronic boost control solenoid out of here. Oh, you need to unplug it. There's a little squeeze plug. Look at this. You just squeeze it and pull it out. Boom. And you'll be able to completely remove the solenoid off. Get it out of there. Next, throw it in a pile of parts for now. Once you have that removed, you can pretty much just let this wire stay attached to the inlet pipe. And your next step is going to be this bracket right here. On this inlet pipe, there's two options to remove this bracket. You can either remove this stud on the engine, or you can remove this bolt here. But either way, you need to remove this. I like to remove this stud because that way it takes the bracket out of the equation. It doesn't get in the way when it comes time to remove the turbo. So this bracket needs to come off. It's a, oh, what is that? I think it's a 12. Hang on, I got a 12 right here. Yeah, that's a 12mm right there. God, that's probably, I don't know, a 14 on that one, maybe, on that stud. But again, you're going to want to pull that stud out. Boop, 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 boop. And I'll show you why again when we get to that. But okay, so we pull that stud out. Now this bracket will come off with the pipe. On this back side, there's this bracket that mounts the inlet pipe to the exhaust manifold. You can see right there. That's where that screws in. There's a 12 millimeter bolt there. This one, be very careful with. It's easy to break. If you've got a high mileage Veloster or a really rusty manifold or a rusty bracket, you kind of see that bracket's kind of crusty. The bolts can seize in there because it's a steel bolt in a steel hole, and you can see how rusty that bracket is, so get an idea there. So you need to be careful there. It might be easier for you to remove the bracket bolt here and just leave this bracket attached to the exhaust manifold, because this one is sometimes a pain in the butt to get out. Okay, once you have this bracket loose and this bracket loose, your next step is going to be to come down here, and there is 1, 2, and right there, 3. It's a 3-bolt flange at the turbo, and these are also 12 millimeter bolts. Actually, there's 2 bolts and 1 stud, I believe, if I remember correctly. I don't know, I've pulled all these out on this side. Some people replace them with studs, and they go with all, like, ARP studs, like stainless steel ones. They're nice, okay? But let me get this other bolt out and see if I can drop this on the floor here in a second. Okay. Wow, that one was really in there. Okay, yours are not going to be that long. I think I just threw a bolt in there to hold it, but boom. Okay, when this comes off, you'll be able to take this out and throw it in your pile of parts. Okay. Now you can see there's what the inlet of the turbo looks like. Mine's actually pretty decent. It kind of sucks that I blew this turbo up, because this was still a good turbo. I blew a blade off of the exhaust side of the turbine on this turbo. I have no idea how that happened, but it happened. At like 45,000 miles, I blew the exhaust blade off the turbo. So I replaced this turbo with a new OEM turbo that I got from Sam Lee at Blood Type Racing in a pinch, and that is what is currently in my car, is a stock OEM brand. It was a brand new turbo at the time. I had come across a good deal on this KDM tuners, or this pure turbo, last year, so I picked this up, and I've been wanting to install it, but it needs a wastegate. So I was either waiting to get a spare parts wastegate, or like a factory one, or I was going to go with the Forge Motorsports wastegate, the upgraded one. I don't know, I've heard a lot of up and downs with that, so I haven't decided if I'm going to go that route. But I happened to come across this blown up turbo housing. This one is super damaged, and it still has the factory wastegate on it. So as long as this wastegate's still good, I'm going to test it. This wastegate will go on that turbo, and then this turbo will go on my car. So that will leave me with a good factory stock turbo to put on the shelf for parts. So that'll be good. Anyway, back to the task at hand. Here we are. We have a little bit better of a view of what the exhaust manifold looks like bolted to the back of the block here. And you can see now what the inlet side of the turbo looks like. There's our little turbine. Choo, 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 choo. Choo, you know, make turbo noises. This is the exhaust side of the turbo. Okay. And our next step, our next major thing that we need to unhook off of the turbo after we've done the inlet is going to be the downpipe and disconnecting the exhaust. Okay. You can see here on the exhaust side of the turbo, there's a 12 millimeter nut right there. It's on a stud. There again is 3 of them. It's a 3-bolt flange. So there's one here up in this top corner. There's one way right back in here. It's hard to see where my finger is. There's another one under here. Oh, you're going to be able to see that one too? Yep. Right there. Okay. So there's 1, 2. You can actually see it off the back side here. And then 3, again, right on top here. It is going to be a combination of above and below worth of wrenches to get these loose. These are probably going to be your biggest battle, but I have some tips. First thing first, before you even worry about the rest of the downpipe, you're going to want to spray all 3 of these with some form of PB Blaster or WD-40 or some kind of lubricating penetrant oil of some sort, because these are on the exhaust side of the turbo, meaning they get extremely hot, and they are steel nuts on steel studs into a cast steel housing, and they seize up and they get rusty and they become a nightmare. If you have that problem, you're going to want to replace those studs with nice, pretty ARP hardware. Okay, now this is stainless steel studs with stainless steel washers and really, really nice stainless steel nuts. On the end of the studs, you could put an Allen wrench in there so you can tighten the studs and you can easily remove them if you need to replace them. But ARP hardware is the way to go when you're installing a downpipe or you're doing exhaust of any kind on here and you need to remove the downpipe, especially if you are replacing a turbo. I promise you it's worth the extra money to get ARP hardware, at least for the exhaust side of the turbo. You don't really have to get ARP hardware over here because this is the intake side. It's aluminum. You really don't have any issue with seizing up bolts over there. But on this side, it gets hot and cold and expands and contracts and gets rusty, and these can be a pain in the butt. Okay, so enough said about that. In order to remove the downpipe, you have these 2 great big giant nuts and springs on here that hold tension on the downpipe to the 90-degree elbow that connects to your turbo. Okay, so what you want to do is disconnect your downpipe in 2 places and remove the downpipe. I find it easiest to remove your 2 bolts here or 2 nuts here first. Get those undone because those are going to be another battle. You're going to want to squirt those with another penetrant of some kind because, again, these are going to be a pain in the butt. Replace these with stainless steel as well, and they won't rust and you won't have problems with them anymore, people. Okay, you're going to want to remove the downpipe. Remove your 2 here and remove your nut there and remove your nut there. And once you have done so, you will be able to separate your downpipe from your 90-degree elbow and get the downpipe out of the equation. It'll be out of the way, okay? There are O2 sensors that are screwed into your downpipe. Those do not need to come out of the downpipe. You can leave those in the downpipe. All you need to do is just unplug them. There's a harness that comes right up here and clips into this bracket right here. All you're going to want to do is just pull those out of this bracket, poop, poop, and unplug the O2 sensors, and you'll be able to remove the downpipe out of the car without doing anything else, okay? You're going to take the wires that are off of this bracket and just kind of lay them off to the side. And the next thing you're going to want to do is remove this bracket while you're there. These are 12 millimeter bolts, or I'm sorry, nuts, 12 millimeter, 1, 2, right here, boom, boom. And if you remove these, this whole bracket will be able to come up and out of the way. The reason why you're removing this, again, is so that when it comes time to remove the turbo out of the engine bay from back behind, in front of the firewall there, that bracket is not going to get in your way. It's not going to get it hung up on anything. You're not going to be fighting it. Okay. The other thing you're going to want to remove while you're back here, if you haven't already done so, so if you're doing this method of leaving the valve cover on, you're doing my method, and you're leaving the valve cover on, you're going to want to take this heat shield off
there is two 10mm bolts here in the back of this heat shield. This heat shield is virtually pointless. It's completely unnecessary. Let's get it out of the way. I think I loosened these. Yeah, I loosened these already. So again, you're going to want to remove this heat shield. Boom. Super quick and easy. Get it out of the way. Okay, and the reason why we're removing this heat shield, I will show you. Boom. That, again, that heat shield's garbage. Throw that away. You don't need that. We removed that heat shield because now it gave us a nice clean line of shot to all of the nuts that hold the exhaust manifold to the backside of the engine. And you can see now, we can kind of come down from the top here. Again, we got a way cleaner shot at all of them. I believe there is 10 of them. Let's see here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 9 of them. So there's 9 nuts around here. They are 10mm. No, they're 12s. I think they're 12s. Hold on. Let's see. I forget. Yeah, they're 12s. Okay. So you've got 12mm nuts all around the exhaust manifold. Before we get these off here, let me get this, let me get the downpipe out of the way. I can get this. I loosened these already. So we'll get the downpipe off of here. And move into the next step. Okay. So there's the 90-degree elbow that the downpipe connects to. And you can see there's 3 holes in it. That's the 3 studs right there on the exhaust side of the turbo. Okay. I'm going to grab a flashlight here and show you. So that is the exhaust side of the turbo while it's installed. You can see there's a little turbine in here as well, and it's really hard to see, but there are blades missing from that. There's chunks of it missing from that. I basically blew this turbo up a couple years ago. I don't know, I was doing a pull in it, and all of a sudden, poof, the turbo was gone. So, not sure what happened there, but basically I had a turbo failure. I don't know if like I overboosted or I honestly had no idea what caused that. But anyway, that's what the turbo looks like with all of the downpipe removed and the turbo inlet removed. I should have also mentioned you need to remove the hot pipe from the charge pipe from the bottom of the turbo. In this scenario here, it's already obviously removed, so you're not seeing that. If you were underneath your car, there would be a hose clamp around here, right here on the turbo, boom, and there's a rubber or a silicone, connection to your charge pipe that runs underneath the engine up to your intercooler. You're going to want to disconnect this. The easiest thing would be to just remove this whole section of hose out of here, get it out of the way. So like unhook it off the back side of the charge pipe, unhook it off the turbo, and get it out of the way. Once you have done that, we are now ready to get into removing these coolant lines and removing the oil lines, the feed and the return off the turbo. Only after you have at least broken all of these loose without hopefully pulling studs or stripping studs or having any issues. Hopefully you've been able to remove all of these off of this manifold, because the last thing you want to do is make a mess of coolant and oil once you've disconnected these lines, and then be fighting, trying to get, a couple of these nuts loose, or one of these nuts, is giving you trouble, and you've already made a mess of oil and coolant everywhere. So I say that because a mess is nearly inevitable in this scenario. When you're removing the turbo in this car, you're going to have oil leaking out of it, and you're going to have coolant leaking out of it from the inlet and outlet of coolant and the inlet and outlet of oil on the turbo. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to disconnect any of that stuff until I have everything else loose and ready to go, so that this is my very last step. I just disconnect these two lines, and I disconnect the oil feed line and return line, and boom, I'm ready to pull the turbo out. So that's where we're at. Get all of these out, and make sure your coolant's drained, and make sure your oil's drained. And here on the back of the turbo, there's these two great big bolts, and under these great big bolts are copper washers, much like you would see on a caliper pin or a caliper bleeder. This is basically a bolt with a hole in it that allows coolant to come in and out of these lines and cool the turbo. So in order to disconnect them off the turbo, a wrench or a ratchet, probably a wrench. I like using a ratchet wrench. You get a little bit more leverage out of that way. But you're going to want to break these loose and disconnect the lines. Now, you don't need to completely take these lines out of the engine bay. All you need to do is take these two bolts off of the turbo and fold these lines kind of back up out of the way. You can kind of zip tie them out of the way. Just get them off to the side and pushed off to the side, okay? Because now you are ready to, if you haven't already done the engine mount, you're going to want to remove the engine mount. Let's come back over here to mine. You're going to want to remove the engine mount over here. Those are, I forget what size those are. Those are 17s. I happen to have one right there. These are 17 millimeter, boom, boom, boom. And then there's one here at the top. And this top bracket will completely come out. And that bottom bracket stays bolted to the engine. If you have one, I suppose you could use a engine hoist, and you can hook here in this loop on your alternator bracket. You can hook here, and you can support the side of the engine that way. I just find that once you have an engine hoist in here, hooked here, it's kind of difficult to maneuver the engine around and get it to lean and sink down enough to get the turbo from back behind the engine. So I recommend doing my method with the jack. If you have a spare jack, obviously you got your car jacked up, hopefully on jack stands and such. So you can use your jack with, a piece of wood under the engine and support it that way. So the idea is to get it to kind of sink down enough and lean forward enough so that you can pull the turbo out through the top here in between the firewall. So, okay, with that being said, we're a half hour in, and I think I'm going to pull the rest of the turbo off in the second video. So I will be removing these studs here, and I'll have this turbo off the vehicle, or off this engine. And I will be able to then show you a little bit more what's damaged on this one. I'll break down what got damaged on that one, and then I'll show you a closer look of the pure turbo, the stuffed turbo. And then you'll also be able to see in video 2 what the exhaust ports look like with the valves and stuff once we get the manifold off of here. So stay tuned for part 2 if you are interested in learning more here. I wanted to say, I have already removed the turbo supply line, oil line, and the drain line on this turbo. And unfortunately, I misplaced them. So those are something that you don't want to reuse. Most of the time, you're replacing a turbo because it has failed. It's blown up in some way. And that could have caused metal shrapnel or who knows what to be blown through and getting stuck and lodged in the supply line and the drain line on your turbo. So it's really a good idea to replace them with new. At least the return, like the drain, the oil drain line off the turbo, because that's the one that's going to get crap really stuck in it. You know, you're going to want to make sure if you are reusing it that you clean it really, really well, because the last thing you want is to put a brand new turbo on and reuse those lines and blow metal shrapnel back into your, you know, your oil in your engine, your whole engine at that point. So keep that in mind. Unfortunately, in this video, I don't have those parts, so I don't have the turbo feed or the drain to show you specifically. But again, one bolt's right here at the top, and it kind of cuts down around, and there's two 10mm bolts here. There is a gasket in between the flange of the oil feed and the engine block. And then here at the bottom of the turbo, right there, there is another two 10mm bolts, and there will be a gasket there. And then you have this silver, like S-shaped 1/2-inch tube, and it runs right down. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me zoom out here. And it runs to right here. So again, there'll be two 10mm bolts and another gasket. You remove those, and once you remove that, you're going to have oil draining out of the turbo, and you're going to have oil draining here out of the back of the block a little bit. Especially if you did not drain your oil, that's where your mess comes from. So again, it right here off the bottom of the turbo, it's just like a little S-curve, like silver tube that connects right here. Really easy to remove that and get that out of the way before you go to pull the turbo, because you'll bend those lines and you'll break those lines, and then you won't be able to reuse them if you have to reuse them. So, okay. I think that's it. That's it for this video. Catch me in the next video. And again, we'll be talking about the stuffed turbo, the blown up turbo. I'll show you what all this looks like taken off.
I want to say that this project can easily be done in your garage with a jack and some jack stands and some basic tools. You really don't need anything too fancy to replace this turbo on this car. It's fairly straightforward. Not a whole lot to mess up, as long as you do it in a certain order. You know, it kind of makes things a little easier. If you kind of do things out of order, you find yourself fighting against other things or other parts that might be in the way. So, you know, I hope my video today does help explain the process a little bit. I thought it was best to show what the turbo looks like and what I'm pointing at with the engine here on the stand out of the engine bay. You know, you can relate everything that I've shown you into your own factory engine bay, and probably do this yourself if you need to replace the turbo in this car. The turbo failure rate of this platform is fairly common. I'm not going to say it happens as much as the blown up engine issues or the oil consumption issues and things like that, but turbo failures on this car are very known to happen, and can be kind of expensive if you're paying someone to replace the turbo for you. So just kind of keep that in mind. You know, you could pick up a brand new turbo for, you know, $500-600 in some examples, sometimes a little more. You can get maybe a used turbo. Be careful what you're buying there, because you can find something that maybe looks good and you'll get it and find out there's a bunch of shaft play, or that the bearings are worn out in it, or that it's just a junk turbo. So you really got to be careful with what you're buying used. But you can find a good deal if you know what you're looking for. And again, don't be afraid to tackle this project. You know, it can be a little overwhelming to kind of go through this whole process. It is kind of time consuming, you know, probably 5-6 hours worth of work if you are, you know, on it and you know what you're doing. But this can be done with little to no mess and not a whole lot of hassle. Really, the biggest hurdle is getting the downpipe off. If you can get the downpipe off and out of the way, everything else is smooth sailing from there in and out. Everything's straightforward. So, you know, really fighting with the downpipe, the 3 bolts or the nuts that hold the downpipe to the turbo are going to be your biggest pain in the butt. And then, you know, getting the rest of your downpipe, you know, removed and out of the way. So, with that being said, I hope you stay tuned for part 2. In part 2, like I said, I'll be comparing some broken blown turbos to a new stuffed turbo, and you'll get to see what the backside of the engine looks like with the turbo removed. You can find me on all social media platforms at Steve the Woody Peterson. You're here on my YouTube channel already at Steve the Woody Peterson. Please hit that subscribe button if you are interested in learning more about turbos and the Veloster platform, and checking out some of my other content. There's plenty of videos to watch, guys. Thanks for being here.